crimes involving real property is what we're going to talk about next, and I'm also going to have some other federal laws that I think are important that should be discussed as well as part of our theft discussion. So without further ado, criminal trespass. This is the unauthorized entry or remaining in a home, building, structure, or other place an owner has provided notice against trespassing. So basically, you can't be on this particular property without permission, or inside. You cannot be inside the structure. Criminal trespass is about structure. The unauthorized entry of a home, a building, a structure, or any other place without permission. Criminal trespass. In New York, it's a misdemeanor offense. Now, what about land? That's considered a simple trespass. Some states call it a simple trespass. In New York, we just call it trespass. And then we have criminal trespass. And then we go up the ladder. And that refers to being on land where you shouldn't be. And there's always been some discussion about no trespassing signs. Oh, well, there wasn't a no trespassing sign. And my advice to folks when they come to me when they're charged with a simple trespass, I always say, do you own the land? And when they say no, I just kind of put my hands up. If you don't own it, and you don't, nobody said, sure, you can walk on my land, you kind of are trespassing, sign or no sign. And the signs really come into play when somebody's hurt on somebody's land. And that's a completely different legal topic. What you guys need to know is simple trespass, you're on somebody's land without permission. Criminal trespass, you're in somebody's home, building, or structure without somebody's permission. So I invite you to my house for dinner. Are you trespassing? No, because I invited you. Now during the course of dinner you become obnoxious, and now I don't want you in my house. So I tell you to leave. You need to leave. But you don't. Are you trespassing now? You don't have permission to be there now. You may have had permission to be there 2 seconds prior before I said leave. But at that point, I pulled back my permission to be there. And at that point, if you don't leave, you are trespassing. Our next theft, or our next crime involving property, I should say, is burglary. So we went from simple trespass to criminal trespass to burglary. And burglary is a felony. And in New York, you have to break and enter a structure with intent to commit a crime therein. Some states just have you break and you enter into a structure, and that's burglary enough. New York would consider that a criminal trespass, but in New York, you have to commit a crime for it to elevate to the felony of burglary. Let's talk about that act. Criminal act, breaking, entering, and then committing a crime. Those are the acts you need in New York to have a burglary, and it has to be intentional or purposefully, whichever state uses that lingo. In New York, it's intentionally for the mens rea. And let me give you some examples. Actually, what I want to point out before I give you some examples, I'm just referring to the crime of burglary. And depending on what that structure is going to depend on what level of burglary or what grade of burglary you're going to get charged with. If you're breaking and entering a home, or breaking and entering into a business, or breaking or entering into a shed, all of those have a different level of grade. So just to work through an example for this burglary that we have here on the screen, if you, what's breaking mean? By the way, breaking, you gotta bust a window, kick in a door, using some physical force. And the laws have, or the courts have established that using any physical force could be opening a door, pushing a door open. You don't actually have to smash a window or kick in a door, break it off the hinges. You could totally take it. You could take a screwdriver and take the hinges off, or you take a screwdriver and take the lock off. That's breaking. And then entering. Some statutes say you have to remain in. Other times it's partial. Other times it's completely. Some states, the breaking and entering and remaining, you need all three. So for example, a homeless man in town breaks the window of my garage door, reaches in, unlocks the door, and goes inside to sleep for the night. Has he committed burglary? If we're in a state that says breaking and entering, yes. He broke the lock to get in. He broke the window and then unlocked the door and went in and stayed there. Remain, if there's some that say remain. In New York, would he be committing a burglary? Is going inside to sleep for the night a burglary? No. He would have to then take items from my garage and leave with them. Or if he has items from my garage in his backpack, but then he's found sleeping there, and I call the police because I found him sleeping there, and they come and they arrest him, and he's got stuff in the bag. He doesn't have to leave. He's already got my stuff in the bag. That would be burglary. But if he's just there sleeping in New York, he's going to get criminal trespass if it cannot be proven that he didn't have intent to commit the crime therein. He was just finding shelter. A couple things about the New York statute, breaking and entering with the intent to commit a crime therein. The structure itself, if we're talking about a home, they use the word dwelling in the statute, a home. And a home constitutes anything that's part of the residence or living space. So if you have a attached garage, if you have a porch, an enclosed porch, or an enclosed patio, that's going to be considered inside the home. So if somebody breaks into your garage, and then there's the door that enters your house, but they only take things in your garage, they're going to be charged with breaking into a dwelling or a home, which is a burglary in the second degree, which is a high-level felony and punishable by mandatory prison. If they break into my shed that's way out in the backyard, let's say 30 feet from the house, that's going to be a burglary in the third degree. If it's the business down the street, burglary in the third degree. Why do you think it's elevated for a house? And the punishment becomes harsher. Because it's somebody's home, right? It's their castle. We talked about the castle doctrine when we talked about self-defense, defense of property. People have a right of privacy. So, and it's considered somebody's, sanctuary. And somebody could be in there. There could be somebody in there. And some states distinguish, New York does not, but some states distinguish between the time of day. If you break into somebody's home during the day or at night, it's even a harsher penalty or a higher degree of a burglary. Because of why? Because at night there's more of a likelihood that someone will be present in the house. So we went from trespass to criminal trespass to burglary. Now we're going to talk about arson. Arson under the common law was a malicious or intentional burning of a home of another. It was very exclusive to homes only. Now it's much more than that. Arson's considered a lot more things. If you burn anything that is not yours and it damages the property, it's arson. And let's go through our elements, and then we'll talk about some laws and some examples. So criminal act, which the criminal act, you got to set fire. And you have to knowingly do it, or intentionally do it, or recklessly do it. And of course, depending, this is where our different mens rea is going to bring in our different grades of the offense of arson. And it is a results crime. So you have to have a harm, which is to damage property. The intent is to, actually, let me take that. I'm going to step back for one moment. I'm jumping ahead. I'm going to clarify. The statutes of arson that require intention or knowingly, the defendant has to cause the harm or damage, I should say, cause the harm or damage the property. When you behave recklessly, there has to be a harm as well to damage property. But that's not what the defendant's intent is. I hope that was clear. I don't want to muddy it anymore, and it might become clearer when we go through the different statute examples. And arson is graded by factors, certain factors, what kind of property was involved, were there people present, could people have been present, and was there an instrument used to start a fire? Now let's break this down. Looking at the different New York statutes. I'm going to take you right in order. New York's arson statutes are very similar to the assault statutes. They build on each other as you go along. So arson in the 5th degree is a Class A misdemeanor, so it's a low-level offense. And it says a person is guilty of arson in the 5th degree when he or she intentionally damages property. So you have to intend to damage the property of another without consent of the owner by intentionally starting a fire or causing an explosion. Okay? So there's two things that have to happen in that instance: intentionally starting the fire and damaging the property. An example of this: you start your classmate's book on fire. That's arson. If you don't like your friend, you don't want them to pass the exam, you're in the library, you take the book and you go into the restroom and you take your lighter out of your pocket and you light it up. That's arson. Arson in the 4th degree. We'll move up the chain here. It is a Class E felony. So now we're stepping into the lower level felonies. And it says a person is guilty of arson in the 4th degree when he recklessly, which means he should have been extremely aware of the risk, damages a building or motor vehicle by intentionally starting a fire or causing an explosion. So what's happening here, the criminal intent here is intentionally starting a fire, and you recklessly damage a building or a motor vehicle. You don't have to intend to do so. So here's an example. There's a no burning trash law in the county, but you don't care, and you go out to your yard on a windy day and you start burning your trash in the backyard fire pit. You got a backyard fire pit and you start your fire, and then a big gust of wind, because it's windy, blows some of your trash, which is on fire, onto your neighbor's shed, which is about 10 feet from where you're burning your trash. And the thing lights up. Fire. Maybe it's made of some flammable material and it lights up. Did you intentionally start the fire? Yes, you did, in your fire pit. The fire caused the shed to burn? It did. Did you intend to burn down the shed? No, but did you recklessly? Let's talk about that. Recklessly. Well, there was a law that said you couldn't burn, but you did so without disregard to that. Then it was windy. Is it a good idea to start up fires in the wind? But you did nonetheless. So this is a complete disregard of the circumstances around, and this would get you a Class E felony of reckless, would be arson with a reckless mens rea. So arson in the third degree, as we move up the chain here, we jump to, it's a Class C felony. So we skip D. There's no D. We go right to C. Arson in the third degree. A person is guilty of arson in the third degree when he intentionally damages a building or motor vehicle by starting a fire or causing an explosion. So now your intent is to damage a building or a motor vehicle. That's what it says. And you do it by starting a fire, intentionally starting a fire. They actually don't use the word intentionally because the intentionally is in the front of the sentence. So intentionally applies to damaging the building and starting the fire. Same example above, okay? Except there's no big wind. Okay, we're not doing that. Same example above, you and your neighbor. Except you are upset that your neighbor built the shed because now it blocks your view of Lake Champlain. So one night you sneak over, pour some gasoline around the shed, and strike a match, burning the shed. So do we have arson in the third degree, which is a Class C felony, which I believe is a mandatory prison sentence. Your intent. What was your intent? To damage the shed. You wanted it out of the way. And how did you do it? You did so by intentionally starting a fire. That one's pretty straightforward. And then we have our last arson, which takes us to arson in the second degree and is a Class B felony, and that is for sure a mandatory prison sentence. A person is guilty of arson in the second degree when he intentionally damages a building or motor vehicle by starting a fire. So it's kind of like the one before it. You want to burn down a building or damage a building using fire. And when another person who's not someone who's participating in this event is present in the building or motor vehicle, and the defendant, the one starting the fire, knows that fact or that the circumstances are such to render the presence of a person therein. So this is when we have somebody around. Same person. Same as, let's go to the last example again. With your neighbor. You don't like your neighbor, he built a shed, it blocks your view. So one night you sneak over there, you pour some gasoline around the shed, strike a match, burning the shed. But unbeknownst to you, your neighbor was inside the shed. That is going to give a Class B felony for arson. Why? One, you intentionally sought to damage the building. You intentionally started the fire. And there was another person there inside that. And whether or not you knew the person was there is irrelevant, because based on the circumstances, there's a reasonable possibility that that the shed could be occupied because your neighbor owns the shed. If you were to ask the neighbor, well, I was trying to burn down your shed, why were you in the shed? Because it's my shed. There's a reasonable possibility that the owner could be in their shed. Maybe it's also a workshop. I didn't add that in there, but there's a possibility. So if there's a person in there, possibility of a person in there, or if the shed also catches to the home. All right. One more. Now this brings us, well, we already went up to Class B felony, so this one's an A felony, which means we have to have something real serious happening. We have intentionally, again, person's guilty of arson when they intentionally damage a building or motor vehicle by causing a fire or explosion. And that such fire or explosion is caused by using some sort of device, incendiary device, which means, let's just take an example. It's just building upon the last statue that we heard, except the way that you start the fire is you make a homemade bomb and chuck it over your back porch onto the shed, causing a big explosion, and it erupts into flames. Or you put a stick of dynamite by the shed and light the fuse and run. That would be Class A. Okay. And the book itself has a number of examples in this area, so be sure, this chapter, so be sure to check them out, because I'm going, if you haven't figured it out, I'm going a little out of order, and I'm adding a few others that I feel are important. So let's move on to some other theft laws. We're going to bring in some these are strictly federal laws, with the exception of one, which is both the state and federal law. This one is in the book, Mail and Wire Fraud, and it is a federal law, and it's a crime to devise a scheme that uses the U.S. mail or commercial carriers. What's a commercial carrier? What would be an example of a commercial carrier? FedEx, UPS, or a wire, example of that, telephone, TV, internet, telegraph, with the intent to defraud the public, i.e. steal from others, not just one person, the public. So we're looking at more than one here, and a scheme to defraud. Scheme, got to have a plan. So examples: when emailed ads are sent. You ever see one of those email ads that you get are sent with the intent to obtain money or personal data? They're actually using false pretenses, by the way, right? It's a form of false pretenses where they're like, hey, we, donate to this charity here, and, we'll be able to save 1 million children. And what happens? You give them money. You give them your property. And what do? They don't give it to the children they're going to save. They pocket it and go buy iTunes cards, which is what some of these... You ever get one of those iTunes emails? That seems to be the big thing, where you get a email from a recognized name. It's not their official address, email address, though, but it looks really close. And they say, hey, I'm in an important meeting. Can you run to the store and grab me some iTunes cards? And then take a picture of the back and scan them in, right? If you've followed through with one of those, and I got one of those, and I knew it was a scam, but I followed through to see what would happen. Like, I engaged it to see what was going to happen. And what funny story? Sorry, I don't mean to digress, but it's very topical. Is I got one of these emails in my SUNY campus email address, and it was the chair of the department who it was proposed to be from. And I just happened to be standing in his office having a conversation with him when my phone dinged. And of course, what we all do is we look, and we shouldn't do that when we're in the middle of a conversation with somebody, but I looked, and it was an email from him, and I started to laugh, and I showed it to him, and of course we flagged it to the school. But anyway, I'm digressing. Some other examples, a few other examples of mail and wire fraud include things like sending fake invoices, running crooked online auctions, something as simple as stealing the mail from your neighbor's mailbox, right? This is what this falls under, by the way. When people say you can't take the mail out of my mailbox, right? That's one of these things. If you're looking for or going to your neighbor's mailboxes and trying to take checks and prescriptions or credit card offers, and obviously those credit card offers are in their names, not take the letter from Aunt Sally, those types of things. Ponzi pyramid schemes, those come in the mail. They look like they're government issued. There's propaganda for lotteries and sweepstakes. There's schemes that appear useful, like the charity I told you about, false charities, low-cost healthcare insurance. Oh goodness, the ways for people with poor credit to obtain credit. They charge crazy advance upfront fees, and then they don't really help them. There's a lot of them. The get-rich-quick scams. All right. Did you ever I still have to, I want to get these all out here because they're so relevant. So if you come across any of these, you ever see mailings or emails regarding, hey, purchase land or invest in these type of opportunities, those kinds of things. There was a televangelist, the Bakers, Tammy Faye was the female name, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, who did this kind of scam of their followers. Sadly, a lot of them were elderly, and they were making payments to these land condo association theme park thing that they were creating, and you can buy a condo in it, and they were building it and, send us money. They weren't building anything like that. They were just taking everybody's money. Finally caught up to them. So, mail and wire fraud. Bribery. This is a state and federal law. The bribery of public officials applies in the state laws, but there's also a bribery of foreign officials. It's the same concept, and that's a federal law. Bribery, it is what we all know what bribery is. It's when you ask somebody, a public official, when you attempt to influence them to act in a way that serves your own private interests. So, for example, if you are a developer and you're trying to develop some land in a particular town, but you need to have some zoning permits and pass some of the local laws, and you happen to know one of the officials, the common council that sits on the board, and you go up to them and be like, hey, I'll give you, $5,000, and if you influence and this particular person can influence the other votes on the board, and you offer them money to do that and use their influence so you can get the laws passed or your permit, that would be a form of bribery. Who's a public official? Doesn't necessarily have to be someone who's elected, but that's usually who comes to mind in the forefront. This could not only just be a politician, this can be a judge, this can be a district attorney. I'm going to pay the district attorney to drop those charges against me. That would be a bribe. Because you're getting a private interest, something that interests you. I'm going to pay the DA, and now the charge is going to go away. So the question becomes, when does it become a crime? At the time of the bribe, not when the public official acts on your behalf. So the moment you say, hey DA, I'll give you $10,000 if you drop the charges against me, at that point, it's a bribe. That's probably not the person you want to bribe either, because then they'll be like, and now you're under arrest for bribery. So that's bribery. It works the same way with foreign officials for individuals who might be working overseas and having business deals and contracts overseas. We won't go down that route. I just want you to be familiar with this other form of, and I think it's a form of a theft crime, of bribery. It also falls in the white collar crime arena. Now let's talk about RICO. And RICO is a federal law, and it stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. And the purpose of this act was to curb the increasing entry of organized crime, which was entering into the legitimate business world, by the way. Back when way back. I mean, we've had mafia and the mob they go way back early times. This was passed in the 1970s, designed to combat the organized crime in the United States. It allows for the prosecution and penalties, civil penalties, for what we call racketeering activity that's performed on part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. Now, really what it, in its simplest form, is the criminal organization has an upfront legitimate business. trucking companies, laundromats, dry cleaners, casinos. These were all those things back in the mob days that they used to upfront what was really going on, which was criminal activity, which might have been bribery, smuggling, counterfeiting, and it could be smuggling drugs, smuggling weapons. They were, kidnapping, those sorts of things. And RICO is a law that says if your business is performing racketeering activity as part of its ongoing criminal enterprise, you're going to be subject to prosecution. And the business has to be doing or committing at least 2 or more of the racketeering activities that are listed. They have 35 different crimes that are listed there, but I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to give you some of the more modern day ones: human trafficking, bribery, wire fraud, identity theft, illegal gambling, money laundering, securities fraud, mail fraud. There's a whole extortion. So there's a whole number of those things. Fraud. If any of those things, 2 or more of those things are happening, you can be charged with RICO. Now, I say that the reason why this was passed, and Rudy Giuliani was very big at bringing down the mob families under this act. But it wasn't just for gangsters. The feds found other folks to hit with RICO charges. And in the late 1990s, they went after the tobacco companies. And in United States versus Philip Morris, this is out of District of Columbia, the court had found numerous violations of RICO by the tobacco companies, stating that they engaged in numerous acts of fraud to further a conspiracy. Their conspiracy was to deceive the American public about nicotine addiction and the health effects of cigarettes and environmental tobacco smoke. And the judge found that the evidence was so overwhelming that what the company did, that the companies violated RICO. What they did was by coordinating their public relations, their research, and marketing efforts in order to advance their scheme to defraud by denying the adverse health effects of smoking, denying the addictiveness of nicotine, denying their manipulation of the nicotine contents of cigarettes, and denying that their marketing targeted youth as new smokers. The companies also suppressed and destroyed information related to the dangers of smoking in order to maximize their profits and enhance the market for cigarettes. So they were destroying evidence too. So it wasn't just for gangsters. Here we got the tobacco industry, which is a business, legitimate business. Whether you smoke or not smoke, it's a legitimate business, but they're doing these criminal activities within their corporation. Another area that RICO was used, the first cybercrime case, and we're going to talk about a couple of cybercrimes generally in a little bit, is this United States went after this young man named David Young. He was found guilty of these racketeering charges for facilitating his crimes over his website. Let me tell you a little bit about his website, which was not particularly legitimate. This would be an example of, hey, it looks legitimate, but on the inside, it's all criminal when you tap into it. So he essentially had a little criminal eBay, and what he did was there was vendors who were carefully screened, and they sold products like counterfeiting gear, stolen identification information, stolen credit cards or skimmed credit cards off the mag strips that they would use data to collect back in the day when they had them on. They're usually pretty good. All the gas pumps have kind of fixed themselves for getting the readers or the data strips when you put your credit card in those things. Hacker tools, online banking credentials, all these things that people could get that they're legal to have and they're illegal to do things with. steal somebody's identity. It was, you can get other people's credit card information from this website. So that's what was happening. It was like little criminal eBay. So a Secret Service agent kind of tapped in to the game, got permission, made her way in as a vendor, and spent 4 years. They spent 4 years. She made fake IDs. That's what Nevada fake IDs, and that's what she was selling as a vendor on this criminal eBay. And finally, they had enough of a case when this guy actually reached out and wanted an Arizona license. So then he got nabbed and went through and found guilty of RICO. Oddly, there was like 55 other people involved in this vendor situation. There were vendors on this website that they couldn't get a hold of, and it was actually started by 2 Russian individuals who obviously they could not prosecute here in the United States or get their hands on in the United States. So that is RICO. Cybercrimes, just a few of these. We're not going to go into grave detail. I just want you to know that they are out there. They are computer crimes or crimes involving the internet. This is a list of the major ones. We have computer crime, we have cybercrime, cyber fraud, identity theft, hacking, and cyber terrorism as categories. And the first one we will talk about, computer crime. This involves knowledge of computer technology for the crime or the perpetration. The crime can be committed in any one of these areas. So you have like an internal computer crime, which might be one of those worms or viruses, Trojan horses, they call them as well. There's telecommunications type computer crimes where there's hacking. That's where hacking falls in. There's computer manipulations where the end result might be embezzlement or a fraud, where you're manipulating the particular computer in order to have something converted or sent to the defendant has them sent to them, whatever information is on the end of that, but you're using the computer to do the whole point is you're using a computer to do these things. And then there's theft of hardware or software. That's pretty traditional, where you download a program that you shouldn't be downloading. All right, so these are just, all I want to do with these are cyber crimes. You just got to be aware of them. Computer crimes, 4 different kind of categories, but you have to use a computer. Let's talk about cybercrime. A cybercrime, that's a crime that occurs on the internet, online. Okay, different from a computer crime, even though you might use a computer to get online. But you can use your phone, right? iPad. So it's a crime that occurs online. The most common one is cyber fraud. It's a misrepresentation online intending to deceive another for gain. Anthony, for example, Anthony selects 2 online auction sites and creates fake seller accounts on each. He creates an auction page on each for a rare antique clock, complete with a detailed description and photos. The minimum bid is $500. The clock sells for more on each site. He sends one buyer a clock worth $50 and he sends the other nothing. But he's made $1,000, right? This is cyber fraud. Nice simple example, but you can't commit fraud. That's just one example of committing fraud online. There's certainly many other ways. Identity theft. This is stealing a form of ID, and you use it to get financial resources. So the wrongdoer is stealing the identification information of somebody else, name, date of birth, social security number, and they use it to access victims' financial sources, their bank accounts, for instance, their credit card accounts. That's identity theft. Or they get that information and then they fill out one of those credit card forms and they get a credit card in their name. okay? Where they apply for a loan in their name using their information. It's identity theft. We have phishing, and that's sending email purporting to be a legit business to induce a recipient to give personal information. Right, we've all seen that before. You might get an email, hey, this is PayPal, you need to update your account, click here and give us all your personal information. That's phishing. Right, that happens all the time. I'm sure you guys get those emails. I get those emails. Hacking is using a computer to break into another. It's also this also includes mobile devices. It's why I put it under I put it under cybercrime versus the computer crime. And you usually are doing hacking to do what? Get somebody else's information, right? So you are accessing somebody else's database, like Target, for example. You're going to go after Target and you're going to get all those credit card names and numbers, or everyone who's used their credit card shopping at Target in the last 5 years. That's hacking. Form of hacking. There's a number of other examples. And then there's cyber terrorism, a hacker who exploits computers to create a series of serious negative impact. This impacts everybody. This impacts, the nation or the world, like a computer virus attack disrupts computers in like a business sector, or globally, attack on Wall Street would be considered a cyber terrorism. Manipulating a code entered into a processing control system at a manufacturer, at a food manufacturer, and altering levels of ingredients so that consumers of the food get ill, right? It gets sent out in society. This cyber terrorism is a bigger target. So though I didn't want to go into much detail, you need to know they're there because we have these kind of crimes. They're on the books. They're in, there's various types of, identity theft laws in our New York Penal Code and things related. They're not just federal, but these are also federal because they can be done intrastate from state to state. It could be your hacker is in New York, but his target is in California. And if that happens, whose job is it to prosecute these cyber crimes? It's going to depend. It's going to depend. The attack happened against a business in California, but the person here is in New York State. Maybe it's a identity theft. The victims are in California, but the wrongdoer is here. This might be a case for the feds. But if it just happens here in New York, if our hacker is here in New York and hacks into a New York business, then we probably have a state crime. So the specific laws will dictate, but certainly if it's happening throughout the country or interstate, the feds are going to prosecute cyber crimes. So that's the end of our theft crime discussion. We'll move on to crimes against the public next week.